He knows you see it. That's the part that unsettles him, not because you accuse him, not because you demand anything, but because you don't buy the story he tells himself. You don't chase the version of him he performs. You look past the charm, past the distance, past the disappearing act, and somehow you're still standing there, calm, observant, awake. An avoidant man doesn't know what to do with a woman like that. Most people think avoidant men disappear because they don't care, because they got bored, because you weren't the one. But avoidance isn't about lack of feeling. It's about too much of it, arriving before they have the internal structure to hold it. When an avoidant man ghosts, it's not relief in the way people imagine. It's an escape followed by a reckoning he can't articulate. And the woman who sees through him understands that instinctively. She doesn't romanticize his silence, but she doesn't personalize it either. She recognizes the pattern. From a Jungian perspective, avoidant behavior lives in the shadow. It's not the conscious self saying, "I don't want intimacy." It's the unconscious saying, "If I stay, I will lose control." The avoidant man has learned, usually early, that closeness equals danger. Not because love is bad, but because love requires exposure, and exposure threatens the false self he's built to survive. When you come along and don't reinforce that false self, when you don't collapse or overextend to keep him comfortable, something destabilizes. The woman who sees through him doesn't argue with his defenses. She doesn't try to dismantle them. She simply doesn't participate. She notices the relief he feels when he pulls away, and the guilt that follows. She senses the contradiction before he ever names it. That's why she doesn't beg when he goes quiet. She feels, on some level, that the silence isn't strength, it's fracture. After ghosting, avoidant men often experience a brief sense of freedom. The pressure is gone, no expectations, no emotional mirrors reflecting parts of themselves they'd rather not examine. But that relief doesn't last. It curdles into self-contempt. Because deep down, they know what they did. They know it wasn't clean or honest, and they know they didn't leave because you were wrong, but because staying would have required growth. This is where the inner conflict begins. Part of him wants to believe he made a rational choice. Another part knows he ran. That split creates an internal tension that doesn't resolve just because you're gone. In fact, your absence amplifies it, and the woman who sees through him doesn't rush to soothe that tension for him. She lets it exist. That alone is threatening. He starts replaying interactions, not out of longing, but out of self-justification. He looks for moments that prove he was right to leave. He reframes your needs as demands, your honesty as pressure, your presence as intrusion. But even as he builds that narrative, there's a quieter voice underneath it saying, "That's not the whole truth." He can't silence that voice, so he stays busy, distracted, detached, until he's not. Your absence begins to register in unexpected ways. He reaches for his phone without thinking. He notices habits that formed around you. He feels a low-grade ache he can't name. Carl Jung would call this a loss of psychic integration. You had become part of his emotional regulation system, even if he never admitted it. Now that system is disrupted, but admitting that would mean acknowledging dependency. And that's intolerable for someone whose identity is built around self-sufficiency. So instead, the pain stays unnamed. It becomes irritability, cynicism, a vague restlessness, sometimes even contempt for relationships, for vulnerability, for people who need too much. But that contempt is misdirected. It's aimed inward. He's angry at himself for feeling anything at all, angry that you mattered, angry that your presence revealed needs he spent his life trying to deny. And here's where the woman who sees through him is different. She doesn't mistake that anger for strength. She recognizes it as fear, fear of dependence, fear of exposure, fear of being seen as ordinary, flawed, human. She doesn't internalize his withdrawal as a verdict on her worth. She understands that avoidance isn't rejection, it's retreat. At some point, another fear emerges, the fear that you've moved on, not because he wants to come back in a healthy way, but because the fantasy depended on you staying emotionally available. Ghosting unconsciously is often about control, control of distance, control of narrative, control of timing. The idea that you might actually be fine without him destabilizes that control. It forces him to confront the possibility that he wasn't central, that he wasn't irreplaceable. This is deeply unsettling, not because he loved you well, but because he knows you deserved better. And if you've realized that too, the illusion collapses. That's why avoidant men often watch from a distance. Social media, mutual friends. Coincidences that aren't really coincidences. They're not looking to reconnect. They're looking to confirm that they still exist in your emotional world. Alongside this fear sits shame. Quiet, corrosive shame. Shame about choosing the easy exit. Shame about not having the courage to speak. Shame about knowing, on some level, that ghosting is a moral failure. This shame attacks his self-image. He doesn't see himself as cruel. He sees himself as overwhelmed. But the outcome doesn't care about intent, and he knows that. Rather than transforming that shame into growth, most avoidant men bury it. They tell themselves they're not built for relationships, that they're better alone. That intimacy is overrated. This becomes a defense against self-reflection, because real reflection would require asking, what part of me is so afraid of being known? Grief eventually surfaces, not just for you, but for the version of himself that could have stayed, the man who could have learned, the relationship that could have evolved. This grief is especially painful because it's self-inflicted. Nothing external took it away. He did. And there's no clean way to mourn something you abandoned. Often beneath all of this, there's a quiet hope that you'll reach out first, not out of love, but out of relief. If you initiate, he doesn't have to take responsibility. He doesn't have to name the harm. He can return without accountability. When you don't, he may tell himself, you never cared. That story protects him from facing the truth. That silence doesn't mean absence of feeling. It means self-respect. Eventually, something lands. The realization that in your story, he's not the misunderstood hero. He's the wound, the cautionary tale, the reason you're more careful now. This realization is slow and often incomplete, but it's heavy, because it means accepting that avoidance doesn't just protect you, it damages others. The woman who sees through an avoidant man doesn't need him to confess this. She doesn't need closure from someone who can't give it to himself. She understands that his silence is not peace, it's conflict unresolved. And that understanding frees her. She stops waiting, stops interpreting absence as ambiguity, stops mistaking intensity for capacity. What she knows without bitterness, without illusion, is that love doesn't destroy people. Avoidance does. Love exposes what's already fractured. And the difference between a man who disappears and a man who stays isn't feeling. It's courage. Some men run from what they feel, others are transformed by it. And the woman who sees through avoidance learns eventually that her clarity is not a threat to the right man. It's an invitation.